The most unnerving thing about what happened to me wasn't a creature or a ghost. It was a sound. A high-pitched warbling cry that sounded like a human voice played at the wrong speed. It came from somewhere deep in the woods. A sound so unnatural it made every hair on my body stand on end. I was on a solo hike in northern Maine, a place I've known my whole life. The woods here are vast and unforgiving, but I've always found a sense of peace in their solitude. I'm an experienced hiker. I know how to read a map and a compass, and I've never gotten lost. That day was no different. The weather was cool, the sun was high, and I had a full day's hike planned. I was a good 6 miles off the main trail, deep in a part of the forest that doesn't see many visitors. The only odd thing was the quiet. The woods were unnaturally silent. No birds chirping, no squirrels chattering, not even the rustling of leaves. It was a silence that felt heavy and expectant, a wrongness that settled in the pit of my stomach. I tried to shake the feeling, to convince myself it was just the solitude getting to me. I had just passed an old, abandoned logger's shack, a landmark I recognized, but I couldn't get the sound out of my head. It started again, closer this time, but still distant enough to be indistinct. It was the same high-pitched, warped sound, but now I could hear a distinct pattern in it. It almost sounded like a song, a fragmented, distorted tune that I recognized instantly. It was a lullaby my mother used to hum to me when I was a kid. The sound was impossible. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The sound stopped. The silence returned, more absolute than before. I tried to convince myself I was just paranoid. The mind can play tricks on you out here. I started walking again, faster this time, putting the sound behind me, but within minutes, I heard it again. This time it was the sound of my dog barking, a perfect mimicry of my old dog's distinct yap, but it was garbled, elongated, as if the sound was being stretched like taffy. I looked behind me, but there was nothing. No animal, no person. I started to jog, the quiet snapping of twigs under my boots feeling impossibly loud. The sound kept pace. It was a cacophony of distorted memories now. The sound of an old television show I used to watch, the crackle of an old record player, a garbled conversation. All of it was coming from behind me, and it was getting closer. I felt a profound sense of disorientation. The trees around me seemed to have changed. They were no longer the tall, familiar pines I was used to. They were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. I checked my compass. It was spinning wildly, useless. I was lost. The sounds stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and I was left in a silence that felt more malevolent than the noises. I stumbled into a clearing, a small patch of dirt and moss, and sank to my knees, panting, completely disoriented. I was terrified, and I had no idea why. The sounds had been unsettling, but the silence now was truly monstrous. I felt like I had stepped into a place that didn't belong to the world I knew. I sat there for a long time, trying to get my bearings, trying to remember which way I had come. The silence pressed in on me from all sides, a thick, suffocating blanket. I felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. I had stumbled into a place where the rules of the world didn't apply. I took a deep breath, fighting the panic. I stood up and fumbled in my pack for my flashlight, my hands shaking. I shone the beam wildly across the trees, but the light just seemed to get swallowed by the oppressive darkness. I was completely alone. I heard a new sound, a rustling from the ground, right in front of me. I lowered my light and saw it. A perfect circle of uprooted moss and soil, about 3 feet in diameter. In the center of the circle, a small black object lay on the dirt. I knelt down, a morbid curiosity overriding my fear. The object was a small, crudely carved piece of bone. The moment my fingers closed around it, a wave of cold washed over me, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The silence that had been so oppressive before was now broken by a new sound, a single, constant whisper of my name. It wasn't a mimicry. It was a pure, unwavering sound that seemed to be coming from the air itself. I looked up, and I saw it. The trees surrounding the clearing were no longer just trees. Their branches were intertwined, gnarled, and reaching downward, forming what looked like the bars of a cage. And in the center of the clearing, a few feet from me, a faint, shimmering outline of a person stood, its features indistinct, its form barely visible in the dark. It was watching me. The whisper of my name grew louder, and I felt a profound sense of terror. I hadn't just gotten lost in the woods. I had stumbled into a place that wasn't of this world, and the thing that lived there was now aware of my presence. I screamed, but the sound was thin and weak in the cold air. I scrambled to my feet, dropped the bone, and ran. I ran out of the clearing, through the twisted trees, not looking back, not caring where I was going. I ran until I collapsed, my lungs burning, my legs weak. When I finally came to, I was back on the familiar trail, the sun slanting through the normal trees. I don't remember how I got there. I never saw what made the sounds, or what the shimmering figure was, but I did bring the bone with me. It's in a drawer, a constant reminder of the day I stumbled into a place that wasn't meant for me. I still hike, but I never go alone, and I never go too far off the trail. The silence in the woods always feels like a presence waiting, and sometimes, on a still night, I'll swear I can hear a faint, distorted echo of my name on the wind. The unnerving thing about what happened to us wasn't a creature. It was a pile of rocks, a massive, perfectly balanced cairn that stood about 8 feet tall, far from any trail. The stones were too big to have been moved by one person, and they were stacked with a precision that felt impossible. My two friends, Mike and Sarah, and I are all professional photographers. Our trip was a multi-day expedition into a remote part of the redwood forests in Northern California, specifically to capture the sheer scale of the trees. Our initial impression was one of pure awe. The redwoods were like living cathedrals, their trunks so thick they blotted out the sun, their crowns lost in the clouds. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and ancient wood. The only unsettling thing was the absolute silence. There were no birds, no squirrels, not even the buzzing of a fly. We reasoned it was the sheer mass of the trees and their ability to absorb sound, but it felt wrong. A profound lack of life in a place so lush that we hiked for hours, deeper and deeper into the forest, until we stumbled upon the first cairn. It was in a small, mossy clearing, a tower of massive, flat stones stacked with impossible symmetry. It was a shocking sight in the middle of a pristine forest, a monument that felt ancient and alien. We took pictures, of course, debating its origins. Maybe it was an art installation, or a prank, but the stones were huge, and they looked like they had been there for centuries. We continued on, our curiosity piqued, and not 10 minutes later, we found another one. This one was even taller, and it was perfectly aligned with the first. A strange, unnerving path began to form in our minds. We found 5 more over the next hour, each one taller than the last, and all perfectly balanced. The air began to grow colder, and the dim light from the canopy above began to fade, even though it was only mid-afternoon. We knew we were off the trail, but our curiosity and a growing sense of dread compelled us to continue. We felt like we were being led somewhere, and we couldn't stop ourselves from following. As we continued, a new sound entered the silence. A faint, high-pitched scraping, like metal on wood, coming from impossibly high above us, from the canopy of the redwoods. We shone our lights up, but the beams were swallowed by the immense heights of the trees. The sound was constant and irritating, a slow, methodical rasping that followed us as we walked. We tried to ignore it, but the sound seemed to get louder and closer with every step. Then, we found the first cairn that was different. It wasn't just made of rocks. The base was made of large, rusted metal scraps, old car parts, and what looked like twisted rebar, all perfectly balanced with the same impossible symmetry as the stones. We were an hour's hike from the nearest road, and there was no way any of this metal had been hauled in here by hand. The scraping sound from above grew louder, and we could now hear a low, guttural groaning sound mixed in with it, a sound of something huge and unseen moving through the treetops. The sight of the metal and the sound of the groaning was enough to stop us in our tracks. We realized with a terrible certainty that whatever was making the cairns was not human. It wasn't just a prank or a work of art. It was something else entirely, and it was using whatever it could find to build its monuments. We turned and started to run, our cameras and gear forgotten on the forest floor, a frantic race against the unknown. We followed the path of the cairns in reverse, a breadcrumb trail we now desperately wished we had never followed. As we ran, the scraping sound and the groaning above us became a deafening roar, a cacophony of metal on wood and a terrible, pained cry. We burst into a small clearing with a single, massive redwood in the center. The tree was completely stripped of its bark, and its trunk was covered in hundreds of the smaller, twisted metal cairns. The scraping sound was coming from inside the tree itself, a frantic, horrible noise. The groaning was coming from the ground beneath our feet. We turned to run back the way we came, but the path of cairns was gone. The forest behind us was a solid, impenetrable wall of redwoods. The trees themselves seemed to have shifted. The air grew impossibly cold, and the ground began to vibrate, a low, constant tremor that shook us to our core. A huge, metallic groan sounded from the center of the clearing, and we saw something massive and dark moving behind the huge, scarred redwood. A massive, twisted limb, impossibly long and sharp, rose slowly from behind the tree. It was made of the same twisted metal and car parts as the cairns, a monstrous, skeletal arm that reached for the sky. We didn't wait to see the rest of the creature. We just ran, blindly, through the trees, a desperate scramble for survival. We never stopped, never looked back. Not until we finally stumbled back onto the familiar trail, our bodies exhausted and our minds shattered. We left all our gear, including our cameras, back there. We never went back. The memory of that metal arm and the sound of that terrible groaning has stayed with me. I now avoid forests entirely, and when I drive past a wooded area, I can't help but look at the trees and wonder if the rustling I hear is just the wind, or something far older and more alien, something that lives in the canopy, waiting, and building its strange monuments from the detritus of human life. The most terrifying thing that ever happened to me wasn't a creature or a ghost. It was a series of offerings, small, strange piles of food, like a misplaced ritual. I had left the city life in Ohio to buy a small, secluded cabin in the woods of West Virginia, looking for a simpler, quieter existence. The locals were kind but strange, often telling me unsettling stories about things that lived in the woods. I always smiled politely, dismissing it as quaint folklore. My cabin sat on a small clearing surrounded by thick, ancient woods, and the air always smelled of damp earth and rot. I attributed the smell to the dense foliage and constant moisture, but it was a smell that seemed to follow me everywhere, even inside my cabin. I loved the solitude, the total lack of noise, but after a few weeks, I began to feel a familiar, unsettling feeling, the feeling of being watched. The first offering I found was a neat pile of berries and nuts, left right where my manicured lawn met the wild woods. I thought it was strange, but I figured it was a reclusive neighbor's tradition. Or maybe a strange sign that my property was safe from bears or other animals. I left it there. The next morning, it was gone. The next day, I found another pile. This one a little larger, with a few small, shiny stones mixed in. This went on for weeks. The piles became more and more elaborate, with strange bits of twine and woven sticks mixed in with the food. I also started to notice small, misshapen handprints in the mud near the piles. They were too small to be mine, and they were too distorted to be a child's. They looked like they had been made by something with too many fingers, or fingers that were bent at unnatural angles. The smell of rot grew stronger, a sickeningly sweet odor that was now inescapable. At night, I started to hear a faint, shuffling sound from the woods, like something dragging its feet through the underbrush, coming from the direction of the offerings. It was a slow, methodical sound that always seemed to stop just at the edge of my property line. One night, I couldn't sleep. The shuffling sound was louder than usual, and I finally got out of bed and looked out my window. The moonlight cut through the canopy, and I saw a small, hunched-over figure standing at the edge of the woods, its back to me. It was too dark to make out any details, but its movements were slow and deliberate. It leaned down and placed something on the ground, then straightened up and stood still for a long, silent moment. I felt a chill run down my spine, an instinctual, primal fear that told me this wasn't a person, and that it knew I was watching. I stayed frozen, not wanting to move, not wanting to make a sound, just watching the small figure. It finally turned and shuffled back into the woods, its strange gait swallowed by the darkness. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was quickly replaced by a gnawing curiosity and a profound sense of dread. I grabbed my flashlight and went out to the porch, my heart hammering against my ribs. I shone the light at the spot where the figure had been. It was gone, but the offering was there. It was a pile of berries and nuts, but at the top was a small, mummified bird, its wings carefully folded and tied with twine. I felt a wave of revulsion wash over me, a physical sickness at the sight of the dead bird. As I stood there, frozen in place, a new sound started from the woods, a low guttural choked-off sobbing. It sounded like something in deep, profound pain, a sound that was too human to be an animal, but too distorted to be a person. The sobbing grew louder, a terrible, desperate sound that seemed to shake the very ground. Then, from the woods, a faint glow of light began to pulsate, a sickly, unnatural green light that seemed to be moving through the trees. The sobbing was coming from the light. I knew I was about to see something I shouldn't, something that would change me forever. The sobbing stopped, and the shuffling sound returned, but this time it was fast and frantic, and it was coming from all directions. The green light pulsated faster, and from the edges of my property line, dozens of those small, hunched figures stepped out from the darkness, their movements quick and jerky. They were not looking at me, but at the light, and they were making a strange, chittering sound as they shuffled forward, their small hands outstretched in a pleading gesture, their shadows long and twisted in the moonlight. I didn't wait to see what they were or what they wanted. I ran back inside, locking the door and turning off all the lights. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my living room, listening to the shuffling and the chittering outside. When the sun finally rose, everything was gone. The offerings, the figures, the light, the smell. But a new offering was left right on my front doorstep. Single, dead mouse, its little hands tied with a piece of twine. I put my cabin on the market a week later. I never found out what was in those woods, or what they were offering to. I just know that I was an intruder in a ritual I couldn't understand. And sometimes, late at night, I'll find a single, dried leaf or a small stone on my windowsill, a subtle reminder that my old neighbors haven't forgotten me, and their strange traditions might have followed me home.